Palakpak si John Gerald Navera, si Mark Ayap, Julia Minas, si Ma'am Cab, si Luvert Catalan, Ivy Jane Miguel, Christian J. Ramos, Oriel Ian Coronel. Okay, so kita ko yung mga pumapalakpak. Thank you for coming again to our webinar. And to start off, mag-ano muna tayo, konting pakilanlan in a sense, para malaman natin or magkaroon tayo ng idea kung nasan ang mga tao ngayon. Dahil alam naman natin na virtual ang ating mga webinar ngayon. So, medyo gusto nating malaman kung gaano tayo nakaspread or nakakalat sa ating mga iba't ibang lugar. So, isa-share ko yung screen ko sa inyo. Pakipuntahan yung link na nasa chat. Kita nyo ba yung link? So everyone, please go to the link and answer the question. Kita ba natin yung link? Okay. Hintayin natin may mag-respond. LB. Isang nasa LB. Yung iba nasaan? Meron bang nasa, okay, Bicol, Los Baños, meron bang nasa ibang probinsya? Nasaan na yung iba? Tatlo lang. LB, Bicol, Los Baños. Los Baños. La Trinidad, Benguet. Welcome sa nasa Benguet. Maraming nasa Los Baños. Okay. Batangas. So karamihan ng participants natin nandito lang sa malapit. So far, ang represented ay Laguna, Benguet, Batangas, Bicol. Merong nasa Pagsanghan, Cavite, Rizal, Ilocos Norte, Nueva Ecija, Pangasinan, Las Piñas, Calamba, Parañaque, Dasmariñas. So karamihan sa atin nandito lang sa Metro Manila at Southern Luzon. Mayroong nasa Chaong, Quezon. Santa Rosa. Okay. Maraming salamat sa responses. So kita natin kung paano tayo nakakalat sa ating webinar ngayon. Medyo nakakoncentrate sa Southern Tagalog pero meron tayong participants from Central and Northern Luzon and also from Bicol, Region 5. Okay. Isa pang tanong. Nilagay din sa chat kung nasan sila. Isa pang tanong, para magkaroon tayo ng idea about sino-sino ba ang ating participants. Okay. Karamihan po ay mga BS DevCom students. We have 86%. And faculty members, 9% so far. And practitioners, 8%. So siguro madadagdagan pa to dahil mababa pa yung responses natin. But we are expecting more students to join our webinar this morning. Okay, 24 responses. Mas marami pa rin yung mga BS DevCom students. We also have BA Com students. Okay, so we have an idea about the composition of our audience for this morning. Most of them are BS DevCom students. So welcome po sa lahat ulit dito sa ating webinar. So I guess we're ready to start. I hope you are as excited and as eager as you were last Friday during our webinar on Community Press. So let me begin our webinar today by introducing our speaker. Our speaker today is an associate professor at the Department of Journalism, College of Mass Communication, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is currently the editor of Media Asia. It's an academic referee journal published by AMIC and Routledge, Taylor and Francis Group. He is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for International Studies of UP Diliman and a special lecturer of journalism at Polytechnic University of the Philippines. Prior to 2020, he was Associate Dean of the UP College of Mass Comm from July 2013 to May 15, and from February 10, 2011 to October 2012, he worked as Assistant Vice President for Public Affairs and Director of System Information Office of the University of the Philippines System. He spent some time as visiting professor at Hanam University's Linton Global College in Daejeon, South Korea from March 2009 to February 2010. Prior to teaching full-time in UP Diliman, he was editor-in-chief and head of research of Ibon Foundation and an independent Ibon Foundation, which is an independent research think tank. He also taught political science part-time at De La Salle University from 1993 to 1995. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Communication, major in journalism, cum laude, and most outstanding journalism student at UP Diliman in 1991. He holds a Master of Arts degree in Philippine Studies with high distinction from the De La Salle University, Manila, and he is currently writing his dissertation to fulfill his requirements for the degree of Doctor Philosophy at Ilmenau University of Technology in Germany. So everybody, please welcome our speaker for this morning, Professor Danilo Araw.
Hello, good morning to all of you. Pam, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Morning, sir.
Okay, good morning. Just to make a disclosure, Dr. Pam Custodio is Associate Editor also of Media Asia, and I'm very privileged to work with her in the same way that I'm privileged to work with UPLB. It's not very much known to people that the UP Diliman College of Mass Communication started with the faculty of UPLB, the likes of Dr. Cesar Mercado, among many other faculty of UPLB. In 1965, if I'm not mistaken, they took the time to go to Diliman to help develop our own College of Mass Communication. So we have very close relationship with our friends at UPLB, and it's a privilege to share this particular conversation with you on ethical journalism. So without much delay, let me now share my screen on the subject. What we will do right now is to provide a quick overview of ethical journalism because our objective this morning is to have a longer period of conversation regarding the various aspects of ethics, as well as what we call the normative standards of journalism. When you say normative, basically it refers to what journalists should do, which is a very, very tricky task. It's something that's much easier said than done because, as we all know, life is very complicated right now, especially during the pandemic. And sometimes we don't know what is right and what is wrong. And the purpose this morning is to give us an idea of what should be done. And as students of communication and journalism, perhaps this is the time to reflect on what the proper method is regarding research and writing in trying to produce various journalistic outputs. So in the next slide, you can see there my discussion outline. Okay, wait. Mhm. Okay, there. So the outline is basically quite self-explanatory. So we start with the context of journalism practice. In any discussion on journalism, we start with the context. We start with the overall landscape. And then from there, we try to define certain terms. So given the lack of time that we have, we will just try to define one concept, which is ethics. And then we proceed with the ethical commands, the SPJ, or the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, the Filipino Journalists Code of Ethics. And then we will try to have an overview of how to solve certain ethical dilemmas. And then much of the discussion will be, ironically, in the second to the last part of our discussion, which would be the case studies. And then we will have some concluding remarks. And then after that, as I mentioned, much of the time spent this morning should be on questions that you may have, or if you don't want to ask questions, then I will be the one to ask the questions. In the house rules of this particular lecture, I only have one request to the students, to the teachers who are here right now. In the next few minutes, pretend that you are listening to me and pretend that you are paying attention. And then after that, I will pretend to ask questions. Okay? Thank you very much. So let's start with the context. There's a lot to say about Philippine journalism right now, but I guess the most relevant for us would be the results of the survey released by the social weather stations only last week, only last Friday. Although the study was conducted from July 3 to 6, the answer to the question, is it dangerous to print or broadcast anything against the administration, even if it is the truth, was released only last Friday. So it appears that there's a slight majority, about 51% agree that it is dangerous to do so right now. But what's interesting is that the same survey yielded another aspect related to press freedom, because respondents, 59% of the respondents would tend to agree that the decision of Congress not to renew the franchise of ABS-CBN is a major blow to press freedom. This is the case even if there are certain government officials who tend to claim that what ABS-CBN did was to violate the law, so therefore press freedom should not be in the equation. But the sentiments of people seem to be the exact opposite based on this empirical data. And of course, let's not forget the other interesting finding in this particular National Mobile Survey of SWS. About 75% of those surveyed believe that ABS-CBN should be granted a franchise. What's that got to do with ethical journalism? Quite a lot. Because right now, we are faced with, that for lack of a better term, $1 million question among journalists. Is it right for journalists to be part of the news right now? Because sometimes you would argue that, well, journalism should just be about telling stories or reporting what's happening in society. Journalists cannot be part of the story. But right now, we are faced with that reality. In a situation where people perceive certain events as having a direct effect on press freedom, what would journalists do? Would you just sit idly by? Would you just be quote unquote neutral about what's happening? Don't lend your voice, otherwise, you'll be part of the story. But sometimes there are certain circumstances that would push you to lend your voice. There are certain situations that would be quite reminiscent of the dictatorship from 1972 to 1986, wherein the most responsible journalists during the time of Marcosian martial law were taking a stand against the dictatorship. And in fact, some of the journalists during the time of martial law from 1972 to 1986 had to go underground to fight and be part of the resistance to oust the dictatorship. So right now, there is that situation in the media landscape. That's not to say that we are challenging journalism ethics as we know it, or that we are challenging the normative standards of quote unquote neutrality during the time of during any time of society, wherein journalists should just be neutral observers of unfolding events. We're not challenging that. And in fact, what we're trying to push forward here is an interpretation of the normative standards based on the prevailing social context. And that would be the overriding theme of our discussion this morning. We want to understand the normative standards based on the concrete realities that we're facing right now. So we have to start by talking about the definition of ethics. So of course, any dictionary or any textbook on ethics would tell you that ethics is all about moral philosophy or moral science. So the key word here is moral, right? Which is, again, a bit tricky because sometimes you would argue as early as now that what's moral for one person may not be moral for others. So it could be very, very subjective. Even when it comes to fashion, for example, what used to be, what is decent now may be indecent a long, long time ago, right? So this is most especially true in a patriarchal society where there are certain impositions against women as to how they should dress up and even the shoes that they would wear. Sometimes you would wonder, why is it that it is so sexy to wear high heels when in fact it is so inconvenient for anybody, whether you're a man or a woman, to be walking on high heels? Doesn't that restrict the movement of women? I mean, literally the movement. We're not just talking about the feminist movement, but the literal movement of women when it comes to high heels. So sometimes, it's quite interesting if for students to do thesis on communication. Maybe you can also look up the reasons as to how fashion journalism has defined or has restricted, women, not just the literal movement of women, but even the feminist movement, pushing it back to several decades because of certain unrealistic impositions. So, but going back to the issue of morality or moral, so sometimes you would wonder, where do we draw the line between what is good and what is bad? So the answer would be in the second point. The clearer view of ethics would be it's being a branch of philosophy which studies the principles of right or wrong in human conduct. Uh, you know, uh, as early as now, we have to stress that ethics, it's not mainly about good or bad, but mainly about right or wrong. There is a distinction between the two. Good or bad are inherently subjective terms. What's good for you may be bad for others. That's why in journalism, there's no such thing as good news or bad news. There's just simply news. For example, if tomorrow you would have a headline saying that Duterte was hospitalized, what is it? Is it good news or bad news? Of course, the quick answer there would be it depends on where you stand vis-a-vis the Duterte administration and how you look at him as the so-called best president ever, right? So if you are supportive of Duterte, then him being hospitalized would be bad news. But if you're among those who are critics of the current administration, you would think it's good news. So that's why in journalism, it's just simply news, okay, period, okay? There's no more good news or bad news to talk about. However, when it comes to right news or wrong news, or maybe we can be more precise and say fake news, more or less, there are certain measurable basis for saying that news is right or that this particular news is wrong or fake. If it's right, if it's right, then that particular journalistic output would tend to be passable or of high quality in terms of form and content. Of course, if it is fake news, you would know that it's an outright lie. It can be misinformation or disinformation. We'll talk about those two concepts later. But what we need to stress right now when it comes to ethics is that it's mainly about right or wrong. It's not about good or bad, because good or bad, as I mentioned, would be subjective. And in journalism, we try our best to be as objective as possible. So the third point, moral principles which determine the rightness or wrongness of particular acts or activities. So again, we go back to being right about something. So in journalism, we need to be right all the time. We need to try our best to do that because in the shaping of public opinion, our responsibility is to provide not just the right data, but also the right analysis. Because that's how we define information. Information is the combination of data and analysis. So since we now have an idea of what ethics should be, then we need to look at certain ethical standards of journalism. Actually, there are a lot out there. But for purposes of our discussion, let me focus on 3 points stated by the Poynter Institute. First is we try to seek the truth, and then we try to act independently. There's a proviso there which we'll discuss later. And then third is to minimize harm. Of course, truth telling is very much a given in journalism because we cannot compromise on the truth. That's the bottom line. You cannot just say, okay, we will present to you the truth, but it will only be a half truth. Okay, you cannot do that. It will have to be true. If you're not sure, then don't publish it or don't air it. Because what we need to be sure of would be the veracity of the information that we're trying to disseminate to people. Second point, we have to act independently. And that's where the term editorial independence would be most significant. And that is where we try to remind our journalists, our reporters, editors, etc., that they should not be influenced by anything in the conduct of the research and in the way they do their jobs. However, Rosenstiel, who authored the book The Elements of Journalism together with Kovac, said that right now there may be a need to replace Act Independently with another guideline, which is to be just transparent about whatever it is that may pose as a potential conflict of interest. The argument of Rosenstiel is quite simple. You cannot pretend to be acting independently all the time, which is to some extent valid because all of us have our own inherent biases. All of us have our own beliefs. Actually, choosing journalism is a choice by itself. Some of us may have certain, conflicts of interest that may compromise our reportage. So that's where it's important to be more transparent than to declare independence, because sometimes independence of everything can be a myth. And actually, if you look at the tradition of journalism in the country, you would notice that journalism would tend to have certain biases already. For example, you can interpret normative standards of journalism in a way that would stress the importance of journalists giving a voice to the voiceless. Is that bias? Definitely. But is that a wrong bias to give a voice to the voiceless, especially at a time where there is widespread deprivation, not just of rights, but also of other benefits that should accrue to the marginalized sectors of our society? So even the concept, for example, of development communication and development journalism. So there are certain permutations of development communication that would tend to provide a more uh, that would tend to gravitate more toward the marginalized communities. For example, Professor Ben Domingo of Central Luzon State University would tend to interpret development communication along the lines of barefoot journalism, or his concept of periodistang yapak, right? Where you try to empower communities by teaching them the normative standards of the profession. You can sometimes argue from a totally neutral perspective, or, for lack of a better term, from a postmodern perspective, that journalism that's practiced that would be biased for certain sectors of society, even if they're marginalized, would be not acting independently. So that's where the argument of Rosenstiel happens. There is an acknowledgement generally that acting independently may not be so realistic. So therefore, you just need to be transparent. You have to fully disclose where you are coming from. So for example, if you are a journalist like me, uh, and you tend to have certain views about things, then you should be free to voice out your concerns. So it is possible that you may have a social media account, and you should not be restricted by anybody, not even your own media organization, in terms of voicing out your opinions on things that are happening right now. For example, if the dictatorship is so brazen right now, then you must be part of the voice that would be trying to amplify the injustices, amplifying rather the denunciation of injustices that are happening under a particular dictatorship, so that people would know where you are coming from. But of course, such criticisms cannot be resorting to gutter language, because we still need to maintain a high level of discourse with regard to the things that are happening at the moment. Okay, so of course, minimizing harm. When you try to minimize harm, you try your best not to hurt the feelings of people unnecessarily in your reportage. What do we mean by hurt feelings? For example, you cannot engage in name calling. You cannot provide baseless accusations just because you feel like it. You cannot pass as the truth something that you haven't verified and something that you don't even believe in yourself. So notice that the term here is minimize harm. It's not eradicate harm. Because in the process of truth telling, you may step on so many toes along the way. But what you need to do is to make sure that the toes you step on would have certain bases. For example, if these are allegations of corruption, then your research should be solid enough to stand the scrutiny of fact checking. Because if you fail to do that, then you will be harming people with the way you try to present unverified information. So minimizing harm is all about being factual, being fair, making sure that you are able to be objective enough to report what is happening. So that's what we mean by minimizing harm. So the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics would have more or less the same parameters. And what you would notice here is that instead of 3, there are 4. So acting independently is juxtaposed with being accountable and being transparent at the same time. So more or less, the ethical commands of Poynter Institute and the SPJ, they don't conflict with each other. There is an expansion of the aspect of acting independently and being accountable. So both of them are seen as both necessary, okay, and not necessary, and they're not really in conflict with each other. So here we will talk about the 11. Please take note, the 11 standards that's put forward in 1988 by the National Press Club, the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, and the Philippine Press Institute. So I will not read all of these things. I will just highlight the important aspects of ethics as reflected in the Philippine Journalist Code of Ethics. The first point has to do with trying to report and interpret the news in a way that doesn't suppress essential facts. So basically, we're talking here of truth-telling. So that is the overriding theme. Again, in the Poynter Institute's 3 ethical commands, right? Particularly the first one, seek the truth, okay, and report it as fully as possible. The second point has to do with not violating confidential information. So what does that mean? Basically, for journalists, we have to use documents that should be publicly available or documents that are meant for public dissemination. So what do you do in a situation where there are confidential documents? The guidelines are quite clear here. You cannot use confidential documents. But of course, you would counter-argue, what if it is very important? Or maybe as a follow-up question, you would say, why is it that during the Watergate scandal, Woodward and Bernstein decided to use confidential documents, and they even resorted to an anonymous source named Deep Throat, who turned out to be later on the deputy director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Well, there are certain exceptions to such standards. So when you say there, I shall not violate confidential information, that is the rule. However, there are certain judgment calls that are made by journalists when it comes to handling confidential information. The general rule, as pointed out by Poynter Institute with regard to the use of such confidential information, would be the harm would outweigh, the public good would outweigh the harm that it might create. Of course, you would argue that it is very subjective. Actually, it's not. In the case of the Watergate scandal, there was no other way by which Woodward and Bernstein would be able to get the information that they needed to put forward without resorting to without quoting rather the confidential documents that they were able to get. But notice, if you would read the book All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein, that's the book, All the President's Men. Actually, it was made into a movie starring, I think, Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman a long, long time ago. But my advice to the students would be to read the book, okay? The movie is quite entertaining, but the book, there's more information there. Now, in that particular book, Woodward and Bernstein said that while they resorted to the use of confidential information, what they did was to verify whether or not the information, the confidential information is really true. And they talked to not just one source, but several sources. Many of them are very uncomfortable talking about the confidential information that Woodward and Bernstein got. And there were people who literally, hang up the phone or slammed the door on them, literally, okay, because they refused to talk. But they tried to get the information, they tried to be as accurate as possible. So there are certain instances by which journalists would make judgment calls in the face of certain dilemmas. So that's where the guidelines would be important. But again, when you say journalism ethics, it's all about judgment calls on your part. So in the next slide, you would see there, okay. I'm sorry, there's just a time lag in the transition to the next slide, but okay, wait. Okay. Okay, here. I shall resort only to fair and honest methods. So basically, when you say fair and honest methods, then you have to identify yourself always as a member of media. And then when you interview someone, you have to ask permission to record the interview, and you have to ask whether or not something is on record or off the record, particularly for controversial statements that are being said by your source. So fair and honest methods would mean transparency on your part. So that's what Rosenstiel mentioned a while ago about being transparent. Now, how would you explain hidden cameras, for example? And sometimes that's the basic question that's raised, given that there are certain networks, there are certain news media organizations that resort to hidden cameras on a weekly basis as they try to ferret out the truth, or their version of the truth at least. The guideline there is hidden cameras should be avoided. But there are certain instances where a journalist would need to be creative in terms of data gathering. And sometimes that's where hidden cameras or secret recordings would be instrumental in getting the story. So actually, it depends on the situation being faced by the journalist. And that's where you have to be very honest to yourself and very true to yourself that there's no other way to get the data but through secret recordings and hidden cameras. But of course, let me stress something very important here. While you've obtained something through hidden camera, you still need to be transparent, okay? Because the general rule, even this one is pointed out by Pointer Institute, after getting the information, you have to go back to your source, the subject of the hidden camera or the secret recording, to say that we're able to get this information. Now we want to get your reaction on what we have uncovered. So that's where transparency becomes very, very important insofar as journalism is concerned. So that's the most ideal way by which you can resort to secret recordings or hidden cameras. But as I mentioned a while ago, that these are more exceptions rather than the general rule, because even during the times of dictatorships, even during the times of authoritarianism, journalists should still play fair, even if there are government officials or some people in power who are very, very unfair in the way they comport themselves in public or in the way they peddle fake news and all that. So as journalists, we cannot stoop to that particular level of irresponsibility of some of those in power, because we have to be as ethical as possible when it comes to being journalists in the strictest sense of the word. Next, I shall refrain from writing reports, okay, which may adversely affect a private reputation. So, of course, this one has to do with respecting privacy. So, everyone has the right to privacy. However, there are certain situations when the public interest justifies it. For example, you have a private citizen who is well connected to government and who is being used by government to attack the media, for example, by filing cyber libel or whatever. Am I being more specific here? I hope so. But anyway, that's where this particular individual would become fair game to the media because of his or her public engagement. So privacy, as I said, is very important for ordinary citizens. For example, sometimes the most tricky part about online journalism right now is this. If a private individual posts something on social media, do journalists have the right to quote this particular social media post even if it is publicly available? Even if the settings are public, to be more precise. Again, the general rule is if you want to resort to fair and honest methods in the reportage, you have to get the consent of the particular social media user, if it is possible. That applies if you're a government, if you're a private individual. But of course, if you are, let's say, a person who has the name Donald Trump, and you would post on Twitter, Donald Trump is not a private individual. And he is, a public figure, regardless of what you may think of him. Right now, whether you like it or not, he is the president of the United States. So what he says, even if it's just 280 characters long, it constitutes public policy already. So do you need the consent of Donald Trump to quote from his Twitter account? The answer there is no, because as a public figure, he should know what he's doing, even if the running joke is that he doesn't know. Okay, period. Okay, but the issue there has to do with public interest. Okay, so you cannot wait forever, for example, for Donald Trump to consent to the quoting of whatever he tweeted. So public interest dictates that when he tweets something, you immediately quote it, you report on it, because it would have to do with public interest. But if it's a private individual, then the basic rule is you have to try your best to get the consent, because that's the more ethical thing to do. The second part of this particular guideline has to do with public access to information. So this explains why journalists would tend to lend their voice regarding the campaign for freedom of information, because journalists would benefit from it, and the general public would also get a lot from having freedom to access information so that they may be updated with events, with issues, especially those that would concern governance. Of course, here in the next guideline, it's about conflict of interest. You cannot let motives or interests influence you in the performance of your duties. And of course, you cannot accept anything, okay, that may cast doubt on professional integrity. Why is this important? Because you cannot allow conflict of interest to dictate the way you do news gathering and the way you do reportage. And of course, bribery has no room in the newsroom, because you cannot just accept anything. The late Dean Armando Malay said something to the effect that a journalist should not accept a lump of sugar in his coffee. So Dean Armando Malay is more hardline. It's actually better to err on the side of caution. Of course, you would counter argue, what if it's your birthday and you are given a gift by, some of your sources? It's a bit awkward to accept anything, even if it's a special occasion like birthdays, Christmas, or what have you. Most especially in a situation where you are treating them as sources of information but not as friends, right? That's why journalists should have a certain degree of professional distance with their sources. You cannot be friends all the time with everybody if you're a journalist. It's possible that maybe way back in college, you're friends, you knew each other, but when you become a professional journalist, there's a certain degree of distance that you have to maintain in order to avoid any potential conflict of interest. So, the next point has to do with not doing plagiarism. Of course, that's self-explanatory. You cannot pass off as your work the work of others. So plagiarism, again, has no room in journalism. I think we are all in agreement regarding what the definition of plagiarism is. But if you have questions later on what constitutes plagiarism, whether academically or journalistically, then we can talk about it. I just cannot comment on, legislative plagiarism, because some senators would have a convoluted view of what plagiarism is. But if you want to talk about it later, then we can have a conversation surrounding it. Let's not just use the name Tito Soto for now. Anyway, I shall not in any manner ridicule, cast aspersions on, or degrade any person by reason of sex, creed, religious belief, or whatever. What I need to stress in this particular guideline is that sometimes we cast aspersions unconsciously. What do we mean by unconsciously? Sometimes the words we use would tend to be casting aspersions already, even if we don't know it. Sometimes it has become part of our vocabulary that we don't know that we're hurting other people with the words that we use. For example, when we say that everything is a sham, in Filipino, sometimes we use the word moro-moro, right? When we say that everything is a sham or that everything is just make-believe. But the term moro-moro, as you all know, has certain, bigotry to it because you're making fun of the Muslims. And the word moro-moro dates back to the Spanish period when the Christians then when were trying to persecute the Muslims. Uh, there's a lot to say about about women being degraded several times over by the media. Even the reportage on rape, for example, in the tabloids, would tend to be trivialized and sometimes sexualized with regard to crimes that are very very unacceptable in a civilized society. So sometimes you would read headlines about rape saying that a mestiza was raped, as if being a mestiza has something to do with her being raped. Okay, or that sometimes women in the lead of the story, there would be something to the effect that a woman wearing a mini skirt was raped yesterday, as if wearing a mini skirt or wearing something that's considered scandalous would be an invitation to it. So don't get me wrong, sometimes journalists would try to be as gender sensitive as possible, but sometimes with the way you frame the story, you end up violating a very, very important provision in the Code of Ethics. So let's be more conscious of the words that we use because, as I mentioned a while ago, we tend to cast aspersions on the basis of sex, creed, or religious belief more unconsciously rather than consciously. Next point, you shall presume persons accused of crime of being innocent. That's why we use the word suspect in trying to report certain crimes. So for example, if there's a robbery that happened and then there were certain people arrested related to the robbery, you don't say that they are robbers or that they were the ones who stole. For now, they are suspects. Okay, last point. There's a second point there about publishing names of minors. Of course, we try not to do that on the presumption that if you're a minor or if you're a child, which means that you're below 18 years old, you will you still have a chance to reform yourself. So therefore, publishing your names would end up putting you in the spotlight, and it may be hard to recover from that particular publicity. The same case with women. For example, women who are victims of rape should not be identified unless the woman would be willing to come forward about what she went through. But then again, the responsibility of the journalist here would be to ask the woman who's willing to come forward if she is absolutely sure that that's what she wants to do. Because sometimes there's a tendency that such women may unjustly lose their standing in society. So they have to be sure that what they're doing is what they think is right. And that's the only time that we will publish the names of such female victims. But the general rule, as I said, is don't mention. That would explain why Nicole, who's a victim of rape uh, by an American soldier, was not mentioned, even if the journalists at that particular time knew her real name and where she lives, who her parents are. So there is a degree of care that was done, not just by the women's groups but also by journalists in terms of protecting her identity at the time. Next point, I shall not take advantage of a fellow journalist. Sometimes it happens among senior journalists where the more junior ones are taken advantage of by, we're not just talking here of sexual harassment or any form of, or other forms of abuse, sexual abuse to be more precise. It has it may have also to do with the fact that sometimes the junior journalists would produce a story, and then this particular report, this particular story will be copied by the others. This is the unacceptable practice of what we call pack reporting, where one journalist writes the story and then the others are permitted to use this particular article, and then another journalist would produce another story, and then it will be shared by the other members of the pack or the group. You don't do that because that's unfairly taking advantage of the journalist, and then you are doing a disservice to the readers. Because try to think about it, two journalists having the same story, and then they work for different papers. If you're a multiple subscriber of a newspaper, you'll end up with the same news story, even if you are subscribing to two papers. So that would be a disservice, number one. Number two, it defeats the purpose of multi-sourcing, something that we inculcate to our audiences, right? We encourage them to look at different sources of information, but if you have practically the same article, that's not multi-sourcing anymore, right? So you have to try your best not to take unfair advantage of a fellow journalist. You shall not accept tasks that may conflict with the integrity or dignity of the profession. So for example, if you're a journalist, you cannot engage in public relations or PR. So you have to ensure that you're able to do your job independently still. Of course, teaching and journalism, they don't conflict with each other, because you strengthen your teaching by sharing experiences as a journalist, and then you strengthen your journalism by being constantly reminded of what the normative standards are, the things that you teach at school, right? So such approaches would be acceptable. But being a journalist and being a PR person, they tend to conflict with each other, so it's best to avoid them. Try to conduct yourself in public in a manner that would maintain the dignity of the profession, okay? So you have to be decent. So remember that even in an indecent world, you have to be decent. Decency should be your watchword. So in order to solve ethical dilemmas, this is just very short. We just need to be reminded of the 5 principles regarding the practice of journalism. Of course, truth telling, that's self-explanatory already. You have to be sure that your articles are accurate factually and contextually. So the fact should be there, the context should also be clear. Justice would have to do with being fair. Fairness is the key to ensure that you do justice not just to your article, but also to the sources of information that you've approached for your journalistic output. Freedom is also another principle. Without press freedom, you cannot exercise journalism. You cannot be a responsible journalist if you don't have press freedom. So if there is no freedom, you're not doing journalism. You are just doing either public relations, or you're just a glorified stenographer of the government. No offense meant, of course, to the stenographers out there. But the main point here is freedom is a prerequisite to journalism. And that's why even Lambeth mentions that in the absence of freedom, the journalist should fight for freedom so that you'll be able to practice your profession. So humaneness has to do with treating people as human beings worthy of respect. So sometimes there are sources of information that are so unlikable that you cannot even compare them to your pet dogs, because at least your pet dog is cute and the source is not. But nevertheless, you still need to be humane. You still need to be respectful. You still need to be civil in terms of talking to them, even if deep inside you really don't like them. It's normal not to like people. especially if you're talking to government officials. But you should still exercise humaneness. Okay? Stewardship. Stewardship has to do with you being a good role model. That's all there is to it regarding stewardship. So that's why if you're a journalist, you have to comport yourself in a manner that is really befitting your profession. You cannot afford to be embroiled in any controversy because no matter how good you are, let's say you have come up with several award-winning articles, you will be best remembered for that one article which was questioned in the eyes of the public because of certain violations of standards like plagiarism, fake news, or what have you. So it only takes one mistake for your reputation to be severely damaged. And I'm not saying that you won't be able to recover from it, but it's hard to uh, redeem yourself if you commit a mistake and then this mistake is very big. So that's why we have to take extra care in the way we produce our outputs. So right now let us discuss some case studies in chronological order. So for purposes of our discussion, I just want to focus on the lockdown. So the Philippine News Agency has come up with an article. The original title is PGH Workers Test Negative for COVID-19. Actually, it's grammatically correct. It's very direct to the point. There's just one problem. Way back in on March 24, a few months ago, the PGH health workers were not yet tested for COVID-19. So this is an outright lie. Okay? They are negative technically, but for the reason that they haven't been tested yet. Okay? So that's why it's very misleading. Now, to be fair, the Philippine News Agency revised the headline, so you can see it above there. Close to 100 PUI health workers of PGH negative of COVID-19. So notice that what PNA did was they removed the word test. There's no testing, but still they claim that the PGH workers are negative. So how can you say that they're negative of COVID-19 if there's no testing yet in the first place? So that's why this is very unethical and unprofessional, even for a government agency to come up with a headline that is misleading. However, let me just say that the weakness is the headline, but the article is generally accurate. But the problem there is sometimes the tendency of people would be to just read the headline and not read the article. So what would happen? If you just read the headline, you would say that, oh, that's good news. And you would assume that, oh, there is mass testing already, or at least at the PGH, there is already testing for COVID-19. But there was none at that particular time. So that would explain why PNA has been roundly criticized at that time for peddling fake news, because that constitutes fake news already. Another case study would have to do with the statement of Cayetano. Cayetano said, he quoted a health expert who said that there should have been 35 million who would have been infected if the government did not respond to the COVID-19 pandemic well. And that out of 35 million, 700,000 would have died. There's just one weakness in this particular article. Number one, who is this health expert who is said to be close to the World Health Organization? There's none. And then there is that alarmist spin that I've put in, that I've stressed. It's in the last paragraph. Okay? Willing ba tayo magkasakit ang 30 million? Bawasan nyo pa ho, gawin pa nating 10 million o na-effect 20 million. Willing po ba tayo na 400,000 or 200,000 na mamamatay? So it's very speculative. So I really don't know why there is a need to quote this particular statement by Cayetano. But the bigger shortcoming of this particular article is the failure to identify who this health expert is, so that we can properly vet and we can properly scrutinize the credentials of the health expert, and then probably interview straight from the source this particular statement that 35 million would have been infected. So that would be the better news and the better angle, assuming that this particular estimate is based on a scientific study. Okay, now for GMA News Online, on April 7, there was an article titled "Duterte says he warned Filipinos about COVID-19 at the start." Okay, that's true. Okay? He warned Filipinos about COVID-19 at the start. So he did say that. Let's be fair. So is it something worth quoting? Definitely it's worth quoting. However, we have to also analyze it in the context of what was mentioned sometime in February. Okay? Because in February, what did Duterte say? He said that the Philippines is not really threatened with COVID-19 because there were only 2 confirmed cases at that particular time. So that's why I put in red here some of my editing, some of my marginal notes, because you can put there his remarks 2 months ago notwithstanding. Duterte says he won Filipinos at the start, and then the lead could be better phrased by comparing what he said now to what he said 2 months before. This one would be a bit, how do you say it, violative of the standards of journalism, because you see here the National Press Club being quoted as saying that dagdag pa niya, dapat ay maging source lamang ng balita ang mga official news channel. So it encourages single sourcing instead of multi-sourcing, and it assumes reliability of official sources. Okay? So that's the problem when it comes to an article published by Abante, but it only focuses on one particular source of information, and then this particular source of information raises certain problematic assumptions regarding what journalism should be. So that becomes, as I said, that becomes very problematic. The last 2 case studies would have to do with how you write headlines. So not too long ago, I think it has come to your attention that gas or kerosene can be used as a disinfectant, and that Duterte said that he wasn't joking when he said it the first time a few weeks ago. So the Manila Bulletin mentions that, yes, that's true, get kerosene for use as disinfectant, Duterte affirms. So, of course, that's factually accurate. But as early as now, we have to be careful in terms of the information that we provide to the media, to the public. The media should be careful with with the information that they provide to the public. So if you put a headline written like that, it's factually accurate in terms of the statement that was made by Duterte, but is it factually accurate in terms of the scientific basis, in terms of getting the using as disinfectant the kerosene? So what did the Philippine Star do? At around the same time, the Philippine Star came up with a statement. They interviewed chemists, and from there they said that no, gasoline is not an effective disinfectant. And even if Duterte is the highest official of the land, Philippine Star decided to give the platform to the chemists. Why? Because between the two of them, the chemists would know better as to what would constitute a good disinfectant. So that's something that we should remember. Now, before we go to your questions and answers, we just need to stress 3 important points regarding journalism ethics. So we need to depend on our own convictions, our own beliefs, coupled with the normative standards of the profession regarding how we should analyze certain dilemmas that we face in reportage. Number two, we have to be consistent in terms of ethical standards, and we have to base it on our commitment to the profession of journalism. And of course, whenever we make judgment calls, it would have to be hinged on the objective social conditions that are being faced by the people as well as the journalists on the ground. So these are things that we have to remember as we try to reflect on the various aspects of ethical journalism. So if you want to have more inputs, or if you want to have more information on journalism ethics, you can refer to these references that I used for this particular presentation. That's all. So thank you for your attention. By the way, before I give the floor back to Dr. Custodio, I just want to say that this particular slide is publicly available. You can get it from the DOI or the Digital Object Identifier that is there in the slide. So you just type there https /doi.org and then just follow the numbers there. Or you can just go to my Twitter account and my Facebook account. I've already uploaded there the link to this particular slide presentation. Please feel free to download it. That's all. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Okay, maraming salamat Sir Danny Araw sa isang napakamalamang sharing about ethical journalism. We now open the floor to your questions. Please use the chat box to type your questions. Kanina, yung isang participant natin na sa YouTube nanood ng webinar, meron siyang comment, galing ito kay Mark Lester Chico. I like that part when you said journalists should not be restricted by their respective organizations. Now, he has a question, but with safety as concern among their ranks, I wonder how journalists perform their identities online, particularly how they separate being a concerned citizen from being an objective journalist.
Okay. Yeah, magandang tanong yan ni Mark. Actually, it's a tricky question kasi how do you draw the line between being a concerned citizen and being a responsible journalist? Actually, you don't. Kasi journalism is about responsibility as a decent human being. So, pwedeng tingnan natin yung mga concrete practices ng ibang mga tao. Halimbawa, I know of certain journalists who have two accounts on Facebook, one for his or her journalistic work and another for personal matters. Tapos itong Facebook account on personal matters would be privately set. So hindi lahat ng mga kaibigan niya, mga kamag-anak lang niya yung nandoon. Meron namang iba na hindi na pinaghihiwalay. For example, okay, maybe we can mention our friend Ed Lingao. So Ed Lingao, from what I know at least, only has one Facebook account. And he uses it both as a platform for engaging with readers or viewers, the general audiences, and then he uses that also for expressing his own opinions on burning issues of the day. I think the same case applies to other journalists. From what I know, many of the journalists would tend to have just one Facebook account and then yun na yung ginagamit niyang plataforma. And then pag may magko-question bakit siya nagbibigay ng kanyang opinion, edi pinapaliwanag niya na ito yung kanyang saloobin lang at hindi naman ito nakakaabala or nakakaapekto dun sa kanyang trabaho bilang periodista. Kasi wala namang masama kung ikaw ay maglalahad ng opinion mo. Kung hangga't itong opinion na to ay batay dun sa objetibong realidad na kinakaharap po natin.
Okay, thank you, sir, for that. Guys, type your questions. Especially yung mga estudyante ng DevCom 20, I hope you have a better appreciation of the Code of Ethics. So, hindi lang siya dahil kailangan nyo siyang i-memorize, okay? I hope you have a deeper insight into why that Code of Ethics was written that way. Any more questions from our participants? So far, we have 88 logged into our webinar. Char, baka may question galing sa YouTube. Some of the viewers of this webinar are watching from our YouTube channel. So habang naghihintay tayo ng tanong, hello muna kay Dr. Madeline Suva. Ang sipag umattend ni ma'am ng webinar. And our friends from ADCEP, if you are logged in, hello and thank you for attending our webinar. Questions, guys? Baka sir, gusto nila sila yung tanungin mo.
O sige, siguro simpleng tanong lang. Doon sa mga nakikinig ngayon, kung interesado po kayo, you can just type your questions or whatever. Ano po ba yung... saglit, meron palang tanong. Saglit recently... okay, basahin ko na lang
sige sir.
Recently, there was a case where a public school teacher was arrested for posting against Duterte and he confessed to the media. Do you think that the media had ethical lapses due to the fact that they somehow led the person to confessing? From what I know, if you're talking public, okay, I remember now. Kasi naalala ko meron case na din ng isang campus journalist na gumawa rin ng video confession, pero we'll discuss that later perhaps. Yes, this particular teacher, medyo may konting lapse din dun sa media, tama ka, dun sa pag-report nito, kasi parang lumalabas na under duress yung naging confession ng public school teacher na to. Tapos halata na takot siya, di ba? So, kumbaga parang dapat na tiningnan natin ano ba yung batas at ano ba yung protocol dapat ng mga pulis dun sa pag-exact ng confession, tapos yun yung i-report natin. So tingin ko tama naman na i-report na merong inaresto at siya ay nag-apologize, pero dapat kailangang i-contextualize saan nanggaling yung apology na yon at sumunod ba sa patakaran dun sa pagkuha ng apology. Halimbawa, may na-provide bang abogado para siguraduhin mapoprotektahan yung karapatan ng inarestong public school teacher na ito. Tapos yung simpleng tanong, ano ba yung pinost ng teacher na ito that would warrant quote-unquote the apology that he gave to Duterte and to the public for whatever it is that he did. Kasi kapag nakalimutan yung mga detalyeng ito, it sends a chilling effect on others. Kaya nga magugulat ka na lang na minsan yung mga tao parang natatakot nang mag-post sa social media ng kanilang mga saloobin. Delikado po yung ganon. At hindi dapat makatulong yung periodista doon sa agam-agam na pinagdaraanan ng maraming mamamayan.
Okay. So I hope that answers the question. May isa pang tanong dito. Can a journalist still be able to uphold one's rights against sexual harassment without violating any code of ethics?
Okay. Sandali. Pwedeng pakiulit, medyo na ako dun sa framing ng question.
Can a journalist still be able to uphold one's rights against sexual harassment without violating any code of ethics that is being unbiased?
Okay. Yes, syempre kasi meron namang tinatawag tayo na advocacy journalism. Of course, this is something that is debatable even within the academe. Yung ibang mga tao hindi naniniwala sa advocacy journalism, meron naman na hindi. Actually, if you read Vergel Santos's book, yung Worse Than Free, parang si Vergel at that time didn't believe in advocacy journalism. Pero interesting yung point niya. Ang sabi niya, journalism by itself is already an advocacy. So if you say advocacy journalism, so parang nagiging redundant daw siya. So where does sexual harassment come in, or being a champion of sexual harassment come in? Kasi if you're a woman, you cannot avoid being an advocate of sexual harassment. Kasi if you don't become an advocate and if you're neutral about it, parang it's a bit awkward for you to be reporting about something that you don't really believe in. Parang ganito yan. Wag na natin pag-usapan yung politika, wag na natin pag-usapan yung anggulo. Let's talk about investigative reports. An investigative report is meant to expose a wrongdoing. Kaya nga siya investigative report, you try to unearth data or information that hasn't been known before. And when you go about exposing a wrongdoing, you don't do the research by saying that you are neutral about wrongdoing. Yung wala kang stand about corruption, yung wala kang stand about unacceptable practices or misuse of government funds. Kaya mo ginagawa yung investigative report na yon para masigurado na meron kang ebidensya na magdidiin sa ilang individual o ilang grupo na talagang may ginawang hindi katanggap-tanggap. So that by itself is a stand. Now with regard to sexual harassment, if you're a woman and a female reporter, for example, and then you're doing a study on sexual harassment, and then you feel strongly about it, you shouldn't be ashamed of yourself. And in fact, you should use your particular passion in order to ferret out the truth. Siguro magiging masama lang, magiging subjective ka lang sa reportage mo kung yung damdamin mo, if your emotions would get in the way of your reportage. Halimbawa, wala kang ebidensya pero aakusahan mo yung isang tao na sexual harasser. Bakit? Kasi lalaki, kasi may bigote, kasi kulot, di ba? So, yun, subjective yung mga ganong klaseng diskurso. Kaya, doon nagiging masama yung yung nagiging pamamaraan mo ng reportage. Pero sa aking palagay, and actually, let me just tell you, some of the best journalists are actually passionate in their work. I know of a journalist who decided to write about the environment kasi his advocacy is environmental preservation. Okay? So that's why he's very, very critical about transnational corporations polluting the environment. Bakit? Kasi biased ba siya sa transnational corporations? Hindi. Kasi biased siya for preserving the environment or for saving the environment. So that particular passion, that particular advocacy should be understandable and may lugar po sa periodismo para sa ganong klaseng paninindigan.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So advocacy is okay and it actually would help us write better stories if we are really, really passionate about it. Okay, another question from Miguel Durian. Partisan journalism is on the rise now in Western media systems. Example, Fox News, conservative, New York Times, liberal. Is partisan journalism ethical in the Philippines?
Actually, as early as the time of Renato Constantino, it's been valid. Although Constantino didn't refer to it as partisan journalism, ang ginamit na termino ni Renato Constantino was partisan scholarship. Kasi nga, parang at that time, please bear with me, it has nothing to do with journalism, pero medyo related rin naman in terms of discipline. Kasi si Constantino then was trying to battle the colonial view of history, wherein parang yung pagtuturo ng kasaysayan sa Pilipinas ay nasa lente lamang ng mga colonizers. Kesyo yung Spanish occupation, American and other and Japanese occupations became good for us kasi yung mga nagtuturo at yung mga documentors ng history ay mula sa mga sumakop sa atin. So that's where partisan scholarship came in kasi parang the history of the Filipino people as told by the Filipinos themselves. Tapos itong mga Filipino historians na to, tulad ni na Agoncillo, tulad ni na Constantino, there is that inherent bias for the Filipino. Parang sports reportage rin yan. Pagka ikaw, Pinoy ka na sports reporter, tapos may laban si Pacquiao, kanino ka magiging quote-unquote biased? Doon ba sa dayuhang kalaban o kay Pacquiao mismo? Pero we don't accuse the Filipino sports reporter of being too biased for Pacquiao. Bakit? Kasi doon pumapasok yung theory ng framing at saka ng priming sa komunikasyon. Kaya natin ginagamit si Pacquiao as the main frame or as the main source of information at saka much of the publicity is given to him kasi kapwa natin siyang Pilipino, hindi dahil sa ito yung gusto ng mga tao, kundi dahil sa ito yung pangangailangan talaga na mas makarelate yung audience dun sa pinagdaraanan ni Pacquiao kesa halimbawa sa pinagdaraanan ni Mayweather. Sometimes it's a matter of trying to be more sensitive to the needs of our audiences. Kaya kung babalikan natin yung usapin ng partisan journalism, it has more to do with what Rosenstiel stressed about being transparent. Halimbawa, masama ba para sa isang newspaper na sumuporta sa kandidatura ng isang halimbawang tumatakbong presidente? You know, in the United States, the likes of the New York Times, Washington Post, and other major papers, they write editorials in support of certain candidates for president. Dito sa Pilipinas, we don't have that culture. Whether or not that's good or bad, maybe we can leave it at another time. Pero that's being transparent as to where you're coming from. Ang medyo masama sa Pilipinas kasi, there are certain news media organizations that pretend to be neutral, pero sa totoo lang, kung titingnan mo yung mga may-ari ng media, halimbawa, yung isang dyaryo, ang publisher at owner niyan ay consultant ng mga dating presidente at ng kasalukuyang presidente mismo. Pero ang sabi niya, yung dyaryo raw niya ay neutral. Pero kung babasahin mo naman, yung mga karamihan sa mga kolumnista niya, supporter ng current administration. Yung mga nasa headline, puro good news yung nilalagay at positive spin para sa kasalukuyang administrasyon, and yet they claim to be neutral. Tapos yung ibang mga kumpanya naman, yung ibang mga news media organization, ang may-ari naman may interes sa pagmimina halimbawa. Pero whenever they report on mining, parang napaka-supportive nila sa mining operations kasi consistent yun dun sa kagustuhan ng mga may-ari sa media. But to be fair, we have to also admire certain news media organizations for being transparent about ownership and other conflicting interests by the owners of such news media organization. So sa tingin ko, yung pagiging transparent, yun yung makakatulong para mas may idea yung audience on the kind of quote-unquote partisanship that some news media organizations may have.
Okay, thank you for the response. Siguro naman na-satisfy yung tanong or nasagot yung tanong ni Miguel. Next question from Maria Angelica Dinglasan. How do you think journalists nowadays is adjusting considering that the anti-terror law is established? Is it a threat to press freedom and journalism ethics?
It is definitely a threat on press freedom. Yung journalism, whether or not it's a threat to journalism ethics, it remains to be seen. Kaya lang may chilling effect po kasi yung Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. If you would read the entire contents, pwedeng masyadong malawak yung definition ng terorismo. Kaya even the legitimate practice of journalism may be considered as an act of terrorism for various reasons. Una, kapag nag-interview ka ng isang source na identified sa isang terrorist organization di umano, pwede kang masabi na accomplice ka ng mga teroristang grupong ito. Tapos pangalawa, pagka ikaw nag-publish ka at kinuha mo yung panig ng mga di umanong teroristang grupo, you can be punished under the provision on yung parang ina-advertise mo or bino-broadcast mo yung mensahe ng mga teroristang grupo. Di umanong teroristang grupo. So that's where it becomes very, very challenging for the journalists. So parang the subtext of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 for journalists is do not interview people who are labeled as terrorists. Parang yun yung gustong mensahe. But of course, journalists cannot do that. Kaya nga doon mismo may tension between journalism ethics on one hand and the law on the other. Hindi ko naman sinasabi na yung mga periodista dapat wag sumunod sa batas. Siyempre, for the most part, we have to comply with the law, but there are certain laws that would be inherently oppressive, so that's why these laws would have to be opposed. And it is our ethical obligation to oppose such laws because they run counter to journalism ethics. Kaya nga noon pa, we opposed the Cybercrime Law of 2012 or even the Human Security Act of 2007. And among the 26 petitions pending before the Supreme Court on the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, a few of them come from journalists and media groups. Kasi we found it necessary to lend our voice to oppose the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 kasi parang i-redefine yan yung journalism ethics. Baka mamaya dumating yung panahon na sabihin ng mga pulis na dapat isama nyo as the guideline in journalism ethics na I shall only get the side of the government, di ba? Mahirap yung ganon at hindi tayo papayag syempre sa ganon.
Okay. From Luvert Catalan, ang dami ko pong natutunan. So nilista niya dun sa chat box yung mga ilan niyang natutunan, but he wants a clarification. You said earlier about dapat may professional distance between the journalists and their sources. Is it that or more appropriately the term should be more of personal distance?
Okay. It can be either way. Magandang punto yon. Basta ang punto lang natin, there should be some distance, whether it's professional or personal. Or maybe the more appropriate term is we keep the relationship strictly professional. Okay, that's another point. Kaya lang, dapat i-qualify din natin yung ibig sabihin ng professional. Ang ibig sabihin po ng professional dito, based on the guidelines in journalism, dun sa Philippine Journalist Code of Ethics, we should not accept bribes, gifts, or anything. Kasi minsan, pagka may professional relationship tayo with people, we give gifts, we give pasalubong, we try to be friendly to some extent. Pero yung usapin ng distance would have to do with trying to be above the fray and not being affected by anything, not being affected by anything that would influence the way we report the news.
Okay. From Marjorie Manlulu, can you please let us know your thoughts about how some people say ABS-CBN deserved it because they are biased in their coverage? Some people also accuse other news outlets about bias in their coverage due to their business interests.
Yeah, that's a good point by Marjorie. I haven't seen you for a long time, Marjorie. Anyway, yung maganda yung punto ron kasi wala namang nagde-deny na wala namang nagsasabing hindi biased ang ABS-CBN. Actually, ABS-CBN, just like any other dominant news media organizations, has its own share of biases. Kaya lang, ang maganda sa ABS-CBN, may bias man siya. Ngayon, nag-shape up na siya kasi naging transparent na rin sa usapin ng ownership. Halimbawa, dati, a long time ago, it would report positively on Meralco, pero hindi sasabihin na part owner yung mga Lopezes ng mga Meralco. Pero ngayon, iba na, di ba? So, toward the last paragraph or at the end of the broadcast, sinasabi nila yung nagbibigay sila ng tamang disclosure on the matter. We understand that kasi may malaking korporasyon ng ABS-CBN at ang mga Lopez as part of the oligopoly, they really have other interests. So, but the problem there is, itong bias reportage na to, is it something that should be grounds for the denial of the franchise? Should it be grounds for constructive criticism? Most definitely. When I was still part of the team of the CMFR that conducted election coverage in 2004, 2007, and 2010. So for the past 6 years, for the 6-year period from 2004 to 2010, may ginawa kaming pag-aaral noon with CMFR. I was part of the team, and among the many other news media organizations that we covered, TV Patrol and Bandila were included in our study. And we saw certain biases and weaknesses when it comes to election reportage. Pero hindi naman kami nanawagan nung time na yon na dapat ipasara na yung ABS-CBN or dapat i-deny na yung franchise. The recommendations we made were very solid. Sinabi namin dapat ganito yung maging reportage nila, dapat ganito yung paraan ng pagre-report. So yun yung dapat na yung ganun yung nararapat na pag-call out in terms of certain weaknesses in reportage. And the denial of franchise should be out of the question. Now, regarding the other news media organizations, yes, they had the same biases. And yes, their weaknesses are also as glaring as ABS-CBN, pero notice that they weren't singled out by Congress. So that would partly explain why what happened in Congress is clearly an assault on press freedom and is a matter of singling out a perceived enemy.
Okay. Another question from Joanna Rachel Ocampo. It is good that Philippine mass media are generally free from government control as most are privately owned. However, doesn't this raise the issue of media commercialism and corporatism? Is that ethical? And if not, how do the current journalists resolve that?
Okay, magandang question yan. Definitely, corporatism is unacceptable kasi parang from being service-oriented, mas nagiging profit-oriented po talaga yung media. And that's why the media would deserve to be roundly called out and roundly criticized for whatever corporatist ventures it will go to. Ganito yan. Masama ba kung gagawin nating privately owned yung media? Wala naman po. Masama ba kung magiging corporate yung structure niya? Sometimes being a corporation would have its inherent disadvantages kasi nga parang nagiging utak kapitalista na yung mga may-ari ng media, and sometimes the journalists, consciously or unconsciously, parang nagiging utak kapitalista na rin, to the point na nagse-self-censor na sila, to the point na parang iniisip nila paano ba dapat kumita yung korporasyon mula sa nire-report ko. So yung ganong diskurso, medyo delikado po yan kasi ang tungkulin po ng mga periodista ay maghubog ng opinyong pampubliko, hindi mamroblema kung paano pagkakakitaan yung kanyang istorya. So that's where media education becomes very important for journalists and media workers in the dominant media in order to avoid yung corporatism na yan. Kaya lang let me just stress that at least in the context of the alternative media, there are different models by which you can adapt na privately owned ka pero hindi ka corporate. Sometimes there are cases of community media being cooperatively owned. Hindi po korporasyon pero kooperatiba yung nagiging istruktura po niya. And sometimes in the alternative media, kahit na sabihin mong it went through the process of SEC registration and that on paper, korporasyon siya, pero it doesn't function as a corporation but as a non-profit entity. So kasi nga hindi tinatrato yung mga nagtatrabaho sa alternative media bilang empleyado, kundi bilang mga committed na mga periodista. So it's more of commitment rather than employment. Of course, the downside there is if you're not a corporation, then you don't earn the salary that you should be getting in terms of being quote-unquote a professional. Kaya lang, yun din yung dapat nating i-qualify regarding journalism as a profession. Siyempre, mahalaga mabayaran ka dun sa ginagawa mong trabaho. maganda yon, mahalaga yon. Kaya lang dapat maging bukas ka rin sa isipan na kung ikaw ay papasok sa alternatibong media, hindi ka babayaran talaga, kundi gagawin mo yung ginagawa mong periodismo dahil sa ito yung mahal mo, di ba? Parang ano rin yan we are in a non-sectarian setting, pero parang, ayan, pardon me kung gagamit ako ng analogy sa simbahan, parang pagsisilbi rin yan sa simbahan, halimbawa, di ba? Ano man yung relihiyon mo, hindi ka naman nag-e-expect na babayaran ka, pero dahil sa pagmamahal mo sa trabaho mo bilang lay person sa simbahan, ginagawa mo pa rin yon. So yung periodismo, parang ganun din yan. I'm sorry for the terrible analogy in a non-sectarian setting.
Okay, thank you for the answer. May I just recognize the Vice Chancellor for Community Affairs, Dr. Shirley Hamias. She just joined us now. So hello, Ma'am Shirley. Thank you for coming. Okay, question. Ano to? From Lester Ordan. Unethical ba kung pangalanan si Dante Ang at Manila Times?
Siyempre hindi. Basta sa'yo nang galing. No, pero seriously, I was referring to Dante Ang when I mentioned yung consultant na may-ari ng media. So yes, total, sinabi mo na rin lang na Manila Times. Yun na nga, there are certain claims that Manila Times is neutral when in fact it is very, very pro-Duterte. And it is disappointing that it has become that way considering that the Manila Times has a rich history dating back to the Spanish period. And during the time of the Roces, matindi yung paninindigan ng Manila Times regarding martial law. So, yun. We just want to put on record the disappointment regarding the Manila Times.
Ito na yung seryosong question ni Lester Ordan. How can educators or teachers be more effective in promoting or inculcating ethical journalism or broadcasting among students and future journalists?
We need to serve as good examples to our students. If we don't practice the profession, at least we try to get some degree of familiarity with the current media landscape. Hindi naman po nagkukulang yung mga sources of information regarding the situation in media right now. So you can refer to current studies by the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, statements from the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, PCIJ, CMFR, Philippine Press Institute, maraming mga organisasyon na pwede kang pagkunan ng impormasyon. And of course, the good thing about ADCEP or even the Journalism Studies Association of the Philippines and other educators associations like PACE, PCS, among many others, maganda yung information sharing network dun sa mga grupong ito, and we can help each other out in terms of trying to make sense of what's happening in the media. So I think that's the most effective way in which you can influence your students better. And of course, yung case studies. Case studies would be very, very important. In almost every session, whether it's remote learning or online learning lang, mahalaga na may mga case studies tayo na dinidiscuss, and the more recent, the better.
Okay. In your own assessment, do you think the rival network of ABS-CBN has been trying to sugarcoat its content since the shutdown of the Kapamilya network?
Siyempre. Yes. Actually, you don't need to look far. Noong May 5, I assume the rival network being referred to here has the acronym G, M, and A. No? Okay. But nevertheless, this particular network has been called out even by CMFR on May 5. Kasi noong May 5, yun yung cease and desist order ng National Telecommunications Commission. And notice that GMA allotted almost 30 minutes of the airtime to the president of a certain cable association, cable association of cable TV operators. Pero ilang beses ko nang na-encounter tong taong to sa ilang mga media forum, and she has really a very, very problematic definition of what frequency is. Parati niyang ini-insist, one frequency equals one channel, so therefore ABS-CBN violated it, as if other channels didn't do the same thing. Kasi ang alam natin, at saka kung babasahin mo yung franchise law, ang inallow doon, it's not the operation of a channel, but the operation of a frequency. nung panahon ng analog, para lang malinaw doon sa mga nakikinig ngayon at baka hindi pa masyadong alam, nung panahon ng analog, totoo, isang channel lang ang pwede sa isang frequency. But with digitalization, pwede na po kahit 6 na SD channels. There will be fewer SD channels kung may HD ka or high definition channels na ipapasok. But the bottom line here is, wala namang malinaw na violation kung minaximize ng ABS-CBN or any other network yung frequency niya. Di ba? Tapos yung mga sinasabi na bakit daw nagpabayad sa KBO, napaliwanag na rin naman yun eh. I don't want to belabor that point anymore. Or that hindi raw nagbayad ng taxes, or that, all other arguments have been asked and answered already. So I don't want to sound like a broken record. Now, for this particular network, of course, there had been some tendencies to sugarcoat. Kaya lang, let's be fair. Hindi naman nagkukulang din naman yung GMA dun sa pagbibigay ng tamang impormasyon tungkol sa pinagdaraanan ng ABS-CBN or even the state of press freedom. We have to be also fair at the same time. Kaya lang, there are certain lapses along the way, and what we're expecting is a more critical coverage of the issue, not just on press freedom, but on the government's handling of the pandemic. Minsan, total, pinag-uusapan na rin lang yung coverage ng GMA. A few days ago, I'm sure napanood ninyo yung human interest story tungkol sa mga senior citizen na naka-wheelchair at bumabiyahe, di ba, papunta sa probinsya. At if I'm not mistaken, they will be traveling 300 kilometers. So maganda yung human interest story tungkol doon. Kaya lang in terms of deeper contextualization, what we're expecting here is the question, what is the government, where is the government coming in with regard to intervention regarding their plight, number one. Tapos number two, in what context ba nangyari ito? Di ba nangyari ito kasi walang available na public transportation for them? At kung walang public transportation available for the likes of these senior citizens, ano ba yung tamang programa at ano ba yung appropriate na programa ng gobyerno para masigurado na we can transport people from point A to point B? So those questions would need to be asked, not just by GMA, but by other news media organizations. Kaya lang yun na nga eh, the hard questions are not being asked for two reasons. Number one, it may have to do with the chilling effect ng nangyari sa ABS-CBN or even Rappler because of the cyber libel conviction of Maria Ressa and Ray Santos. Number two, and this is something that goes unreported, medyo nagtataka lang ako, yung gobyerno mismo has found a creative way to avoid being asked the hard questions. Kasi yung mga virtual pressers niya, they don't, as inherently, they don't allow the media to be physically inside a particular venue for the press conference. Pwede naman natin gawin yun subject to certain physical distancing protocols and health protocols. It can be done. Kasi sa ibang bansa, sa New Zealand, sa Canada, or even in the United States, you still have physical press conferences with heads of state kahit na merong lockdown. Bakit hindi yan ginagawa rito? When was the last time that Duterte stood in front of the media live? Diba? When was the last time? I don't think it ever happened during the lockdown. Meron lang siya televised address, pero he is in the presence of his people. Pero what is he do? Is there anything that he's doing na in the presence of the media? So, yung question na yun yung dapat na tinatanong sana. And siguro ang challenge natin if we want to focus more on GMA, given that we are now in a virtual monopoly in terms of media ownership patterns, kasi yung media ownership monitor data would show a duopoly. Pero if we update the data now, ABS-CBN, GMA dati yan, dahil naipasara yung ABS-CBN, we're now practically shifting toward a monopoly. Now that it's now a monopoly, I think GMA should be challenged to really step up and provide the critical reportage that's needed right now.
Okay, nag-extend na yung discussion natin sa... No, it's okay, sir, because it's still linked to ethical ethical practice of journalism. Kasi kung ikaw na yung dominant media outfit, how can you still provide credible reportage that is based on very, very transparent journalistic processes? I think it's good na ilagay din natin siya sa konteksto ng parang nagiging imbalance na in terms of media dominance na nakikita ng mga tao ngayon. Okay, so this is, I think, the last question posted in our chat group. It's a follow-up question from the question of Patrick De Ramos. Shouldn't be other local networks voice out their concerns on press freedom? It has been a common observation online from other concerned students for only journalists and few artists voice their concerns as if separating themselves from their company.
Yes, definitely. Kasi iba pa rin kung maglalend ng voice yung institution mismo. So in this particular case, the local networks. I guess if I'm correct in assuming this, the reference of DARA would be the community news media organizations, no? So dapat manindigan din kasi mas alam ng komunidad, ng community media kung ano yung direktang epekto ng ilang mga pulisiya sa mismong lugar nila. So the chilling, for example, coming from Manila, I would be interested to know what the other community news media organizations are going through right now. Kasi we are experiencing a multiple whammy. Because of the lockdown, because of the virus, there are certain news media organizations that are closing shop, particularly the print media. Yung print yung unang namamatay dahil sa pandemic. Pero the other burden that we have to go through would be the chilling effect brought about by the weaponization of laws and the bureaucracy. For example, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, or even hindi na masyadong nare-report ngayon, yung Section 6 ng Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, there is a penalty there for spreading false information, di ba? So that affects not just ordinary citizens, but particularly the journalists. Kasi parang tinatakot ka na pag tinawag naming fake news yan, yari ka. Problema ngayon, pagka critical sa government, yung reportage mo, parang sinasabi nila yun yung fake news, di ba? Hindi pa usapin ng factual and contextual accuracy. So that's the basic problem right now. So that's why all the more that we need to voice our concerns regarding press freedom. And I hope that the community press would do the same thing by focusing mainly on how the chilling effect is affecting their particular localities.
Okay, I think that's a very, very meaty Q&A already. We have a very good discussion. Any pahabol questions, guys? May pahabol pa ba? Shout out muna ako kay Peter Dalokdok from Benguet State University. Si Peter ang treasurer ng ADCEP. Okay, and thank you daw, sir, for the answers to their questions. And okay, mukhang wala nang nagdadagdag ng tanong. So everybody, can we have a clap react to thank our speaker for today? Palakpakan naman tayo, guys. Yun lang yung limitation ng webinar. Hindi natin naririnig yung appreciation ng ating audience. But we can see the clap icon in our gallery. Okay, meantime, may I call on the department chair of the Department of Development Journalism for her short message. Ma'am Cabs.
Hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for attending day 2 of our seminar series. So our seminar for this year, seminar series has a theme, reporting during a pandemic. This seminar series is part of our bridging program for the instruction component of our service at DDJ, College of Development Communication, and also part of our extension program, extension activity in service of our fellow teachers and students, communication students in different universities and colleges in the country, and also our practitioners and friends from different sectors. So I'd like to thank everyone who participated. I'd like to thank also Professor Danny Araw. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation to be part of our activity. Marami pong natutunan, definitely ang ating mga estudyante at kami rin po na mga nagtuturo ay marami rin pong natutunan, nakuhang insights mula po sa inyo. And thank you also to our senior DDJ sorority members, ang ating pong mga ginagalang na Professor Dr. Madeline Suva and Vice Chancellor Dr. Sergi Hamias for joining us this morning. Maraming salamat din po sa ating mga fellow faculty members from CDC who are present in this seminar. So sa mga estudyante po, meron pa po tayong natitirang 2 seminars for this series. And depending on, meron pa rin mga pumapasok na sa ating waiting room. So bumababa, umaakyat po yung number ng ating participants, maybe due to connectivity issues. So this might be a preview of the coming semester. May mga nadi-disconnect once in a while. But we press on despite these limitations. So again, maraming salamat po, Sir Danny Araw, for being our guest. Thank you to our students. Thank you to our participants. So at this point, I'd like for the department to award our certificate of appreciation for Sir Danny Araw for being our speaker this morning. So the certificate reads, the Department of Development Journalism, College of Development Communication, University of the Philippines, Los Baños presents this certificate of appreciation to Prof. Danilo Araw for serving as resource person in the webinar Ethical Journalism under the DDJ seminar series Reporting During a Pandemic, issued on August 10, 2020 at UPLB Laguna, signed yours truly as Department Chair and Dr. Maria Stella Terol, Dean of CDC. Ayan, sir, to follow na lang po yung actual copy and a little token of appreciation from our department and from the college. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, maraming salamat din po. Salamat.
Okay, thank you, Sir Danny Araw, for that very, very meaty presentation and the very good engagement from our participants. So again, to everybody, please do not forget to fill out our evaluation form so you will get a certificate for attending this seminar. So this ends our webinar for this morning. Thank you again. And please come back. Come back on Wednesday for our next webinar. But before we log out, before we leave the meeting, can we all first have a group picture?
Yay.
Care of Charlene.
Yes. Ayan, ayos muna uli ng buhok.
Hello.
Oh,
Sandali
nice
lang ha. Pwede ka maghintay ng sandali.
Ayan, sige po. Mag-ayos-ayos po muna tayo. Mag-on tayo ng video. So currently we have 87 participants po. So 4 frames. Di ko sa view ko. So smile na lang kayo every frame para sure.
Si Ali wala pang camera. Hi, Ali.
Ready na po? Okay. Game na. Ako wala kasi ayaw mag-on ng video ko for some reason. Mabagal ata internet.